All right, let's get right into it. Today, we're going to dig into a really interesting paper that looks at climate change from a different angle, not just as an environmental issue, but as an economic one, focusing on human welfare. We're just here to explore the data and the arguments it presents.
So right off the bat, the paper presents its core idea, and it's a big one. It's saying that the story of this century is going to be one of absolutely incredible growth. Now, the fascinating part here is how it frames climate change as a dent, right? A 16 percentage point reduction from a massive 450% gain. It's a real cost for sure, but in this view, it's a manageable one, not an apocalyptic one.
And that's really the main theme we're going to be walking through in this explainer. The whole analysis treats climate change like a problem that needs to be managed by carefully weighing the costs of a warmer planet against the costs of the policies we use to fight it. Our job here is just to lay out that argument.
Okay, so before we can even talk about the paper's take on climate costs, we have to understand its starting point, its baseline for what the future looks like. And, well, that baseline is incredibly optimistic.
This number, it's pretty much the bedrock of the entire analysis. The paper points to scenarios from the UN's own climate panel, the IPCC, and says the average person in 2100 is projected to be 4.5 times better off than they are today. And we're not just talking about money. This is a stand-in for all sorts of things like longer lives, better healthcare, more education, the whole shebang.
And this is another huge piece of that positive baseline. This growth isn't just for the already wealthy parts of the world. Nope, the analysis actually projects that developing nations will grow much, much faster, leading to this dramatic drop in inequality between countries. I mean, we're talking about global inequality falling to levels we haven't seen since before the Industrial Revolution.
Okay, so we've got this picture of a future that's much richer and more equal. So the question is, how does climate change fit in? Well, the paper argues that maybe our perception of disaster costs has been missing some really important context. And this is the question that I think a lot of us have, right? It just feels like disasters are getting worse. You see the headlines all the time about billion-dollar storms and record-breaking floods. But this analysis asks, is a changing climate the only thing going on here, or are we missing something?
The paper's answer is this concept it calls the expanding bullseye effect. And it's a pretty simple idea. Just imagine a hurricane hitting Miami in 1920 versus one hitting Miami today. The storm itself might be the same strength, but today's Miami has millions more people and trillions of dollars worth of condos and hotels right on the coast. The target for the hurricane is just massively bigger. So of course the dollar amount of the damage is going to be way, way higher.
And this chart just illustrates that effect perfectly. On the left, the raw financial costs of hurricanes are going up. That trend is obvious. But on the right, when you adjust for all that extra population and wealth we've put in harm's way, when you account for the bigger bullseye, the paper says that trend basically disappears. The argument is that we've just built more stuff for storms to hit. The paper then applies that same kind of thinking to other types of extreme weather. Citing major reports, it notes there's low confidence in a global drought trend and a lack of evidence for a global increase in flooding. It even points to satellite data that shows the total area burned by wildfires globally has actually gone down by about 25% since the year 2000. So for a lot of these events, the paper concludes there isn't a clear global trend of them getting worse, but what has definitely changed is our exposure to them.
So if the expanding bullseye is about rethinking the past, this next big point from the paper is all about rethinking the future. And it all comes down to one word: adaptation.
I mean, that is a pretty wild claim, right? 2,000 times. The basic argument is that a lot of scary future projections make this one huge faulty assumption, that we're just going to stand there and take it. They imagine a world in the year 2100 facing new problems but using today's defenses. Let's look at the paper's key example, flooding on the coasts.
This little sequence here is super powerful. So today, about 3.4 million people are flooded each year. The paper cites research that says if sea levels rise and we do nothing, I mean literally nothing, no new seawalls, nothing, that number could skyrocket to 187 million. But it argues that's just not realistic. A much richer and more advanced world will obviously adapt. And with that adaptation, the model shows the number of people flooded drops to just 15,000. That's a reduction of more than 99.9%.
And here's the economic kicker. Yes, the absolute cost of building all those better defenses will be a lot of money, but the world of 2100 will be so much richer that the cost, as a slice of the total global economy, actually goes down. The burden of coastal flooding, as a percentage of GDP, shrinks from a tiny fraction today to an even tinier fraction in the future.
All right, so the paper has made its case that the impacts of climate change are manageable. So now it turns that same exact economic lens onto the solutions, the policies designed to fix the problem.
The framework it uses is really simple, but it's crucial. Basically, you've got the cost of the problem itself, right? But you also have the cost of the solution. And from this perspective, a good policy is one that makes the grand total, the damage costs plus the policy costs, as small as possible. You don't want the cure to be worse than the disease.
So what happens when it runs the numbers on a big global policy? Well, using standard models, this analysis calculates that for every single dollar we spend to meet the pledges of the Paris Agreement, we only get about 11 cents back in climate benefits. In a pure cost-benefit analysis, that is a really tough investment to justify.
And this quote from the paper's author, Bjorn Lomborg, pretty much sums up the whole critique. The argument is that by focusing so much on policies that it sees as expensive and inefficient, we're actually taking money and attention away from smarter, more effective options.
Okay, so if current policies are wasteful, what are these more effective ways he's talking about? Well, the final part of the paper lays out what it considers to be a much better path forward.
And here's the choice, as the paper lays it out. On one hand, you have the popular goal of keeping warming below 2 degrees Celsius. This analysis finds that target is so incredibly expensive that it would cost the world trillions more than the climate damage it would prevent. On the other hand, it proposes a massive investment in research and development for green energy. The idea isn't to force expensive green tech on the world today, but to innovate like crazy until it becomes cheaper than fossil fuels for everybody.
And this bar chart really just drives that point home. It's a stark contrast. The analysis shows a return of just 11 cents on the dollar for one approach versus a return of $11 for the other. So from this economic perspective, it's pretty clear where we should be putting our money.
And that really brings us to the final, provocative question that's at the heart of this entire analysis. It's designed to reframe the whole debate. It says, look, climate change is a real problem with real costs. But is it possible that the biggest risk we face actually comes from well-intentioned but incredibly inefficient and expensive policies? It's a question that really challenges you to think about this problem not just as a matter of science, but as one of economics and human progress.